Okay, so we're back. This morning, Karen Ernst only made it as far as the parking lot and discovered she couldn't find her purse. Uh, So Scott had to leave and she had to go. So Karen, we're doing this whole thing over again just for you.
He's kidding.
That's not true. We forgot to record it. If we had recorded it, we wouldn't have to do it over again. So
today's lesson, we are studying the life of David, and we left off on 1 Samuel chapter 30 at verse 21. When we left, David had left Ziklag and gone after the Amalekites who had destroyed his city, taking his wife, all the women and children, and burning down the village. He went and went after the Amalekites, and now he is headed back to Ziklag. And on his way back, he stops by to pick up the 200 men who were too exhausted to go fight.
we left, David's got 600 men total. They ride out after a much bigger Amalekite force. And when they get close, 200 of the men are just too exhausted. And they leave them behind to watch the stores. They with 400 men wipe out this much larger Amalekite force. They have a bunch of loot. They have had great amount of plunder. And when they get back, David greets the 200 that have stayed behind, but it says that a bunch of worthless men in the group are upset, and they say, there's no way we're sharing. They didn't fight. We're not sharing our stuff with them. They can have their wives and kids back, and that's all. And David says, no, we are going to, we're one people, and we're going to share equally. And that became a rule for his armies from there on out. And it's an important thing that people in your army know they can depend on you. They know that they're going to be treated fairly. And that's exactly what David does. That's what he shows.
And then do you want to explain who else they got all this loot from defeating the Amalekites, and what did he do with all this loot?
So it has said that on the way back, there's so much that there are people going out ahead, driving livestock, saying this is David's plunder. The leader, the king, always got a larger share. But the men do well. That's part of battle. But he's got a lot of stuff. And David very wisely sends a whole lot of this plunder to other clans of Judah in the area, kind of across this southern region, even over to some people called Kenites who were allies, but technically weren't Jews. What David doesn't know at this point is that Saul is dead. And we're going to get to that. But it seems that David's incredible victory and Saul's final defeat came very close to being at the same time. David suddenly is behaving very kingly. And this thing he does is wise, sending this. But I've got something here I want to share, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Several hundred years before this, the law was established. And in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, it says something, and I found it amazing that all that time before, they were told, when you enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Now, first of all, that's exactly what happened. We're told that's exactly, but this was predicted, prophesied hundreds of years before. When you settle in and you tell yourself, okay, now we need a king, then they get these instructions. It says you're to appoint over yourselves the king whom the Lord your God shall choose. That's important. But it also says then the king must not acquire many horses for himself or send the people back to Egypt to acquire more horses. For the Lord has said you're never to go back that way again. He must not take many wives for himself. lest his heart go astray. He must not accumulate for himself large amounts of silver and gold. And I'll skip down. It says a few more things, but then it says, then his heart will not be exalted above his countrymen, and he will not turn aside from the commandment to the right or the left, in order that he and his sons may reign many years over this kingdom in Israel. So here was this prophecy, this prediction and instructions that when you finally do demand a king, he's not supposed to make himself rich. He's not supposed to exalt himself above his countrymen. Now, we see David taking more than one wife, and it leads to some trouble later on. But this idea of amassing great wealth that will then make the king be like the other kings, that he's above his countrymen, we see David sort of instinctively taking the first of his plunder and spreading it out into the other clans of the tribe. And these people would understand that when he becomes king, he's going to take care of them. He's not going to set it, whether he stays with it, we'll see. But it's a very wise thing to do. And it's kind of interesting at this point, especially when you understand that Saul is dead. It doesn't mean David immediately becomes king of all Israel, but he's behaving like a king.
And as we said before, there's been 10, 12 years of him running from Saul, and this idea of being a preparatory time. And it appears that he is now ready. As Scott says, he's acting kingly. And that takes us to 1 Samuel 31. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before them, and many fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and they killed Saul's son Jonathan, Adadab, and Malchishah. When the battle intensified against Saul, the archer overtook him and wounded him critically. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and run it through me, or these uncircumcised men will come and run me through and torture me." But his armor bearer was terrified and refused to do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his own sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all his men died together that same day. When the Israelites along the valley and those on the other side of the Jordan saw that the army of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their cities and ran away. So the Philistines came and occupied their cities. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off Saul's head, stripped off his armor, and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temples of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths and hung his body on the wall of Bethshean. When the people of Jabesh Gilead heard that the Philistines had done to Saul, all their men of valor set out, journeyed all night, and retrieved the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bethshean. When they arrived at Jabesh, they burned the bodies there. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh and fasted 7 days.
So the short version is Saul's defeated. The Philistines are, even though Saul has the high ground, they're up on Mount Gilboa. They're just outnumbered. Saul is destined to die this day anyway. And he gets shot by an arrow. He's dying and he chooses to commit suicide. He wants an armor bearer to kill him. It's not something he was supposed to do, but he did. And it's always been sort of Saul's
Downfall.
Weakness of character, I guess. It's not totally something that you can't understand, but at the same time, it's not something he should have done. And when the people see it, they split. When they find out Saul is dead, and you have to understand that Mount Gilboa is this tall, kind of steep hump. Saul can see for miles. People can also see what's going on up on top of it.
It's probably a
And-
good time to show the video right now.
Oh, it's
Gives
great
you
if you can
time.
figure it out. yeah.
Okay, let's see if we can do this better this time. 1. Share computer sound. Share. I'm going to do the whole screen and play.
Reading through 1 Samuel, you start to see some really strong contrasts between who God allowed to be king first with who he rose up to be king second. And I think this final battle at Mount Gilboa is the pinnacle of that. At approximately the same time, you have 2 battles going on. You've got the battle here in the valley, and then you've got David, whose family has just been kidnapped from Ziklag. And they both have to make a decision. How do we figure out what we're going to do? And Saul tries to communicate with the Lord, but the Lord's not responding to him anymore. David, when he gets to Ziklag, he appeals to God and says, should I pursue these attackers? And so you've got this contrast that here's this final downfall of Saul as a king, and simultaneously, David, after 10 years of running, is raised up to serve as this new king who's going to expand and stabilize Israel. The battle that is described in 1 Samuel mentions a lot of different geographical locations.
Saul died right here. This is where the end of his life happened. And one of the things I love about the Bible is the geographical accuracy. And you can actually see that here. It mentions at the end of 1 Samuel, the Philistines were encamped at Shunem, which sits at the base of the hill of Moreh across the valley. The Israelites were encamped over here on Gilboa. And the night before, Saul wanted to talk to a medium over in Endor. Endor is just on the eastern side of the hill of Moreh. If you think about that, he went over there at night in disguise, but he had to go around the Philistine army just to get there.
To look down on the valley and have the battle drawn out. This is where people moved, and this is where Saul went at night and snuck around the army and then came back around. You can sense his desperation. What king would do that? The king is the high target in any battle, but he's willing to risk himself at night before the battle starts to try to get someone to tell him what's going to happen, even though Samuel's already told him.
The battle ensued, and that battle took place somewhere between here and the hill of Moreh.
Saul is moving back this way. So as the Philistines are defeating the Israelites are retreating or maybe trying to get to high ground, coming and moving up Mount Gilboa. Saul takes an arrow and then he falls on his sword, and then an Amalekite is coming along. Saul asks him to kill him before the Philistines find him, and that's how he dies. And so it all just continues moving this way.
Then his body, as well as the body of his 3 sons, were taken to Bethshan, and those bodies were hung on the wall of Bethshan.
It was an Israelite city, but it was occupied by the Philistines. They had worked their way that far into the valley.
And the citizens of Jabesh-Gilead found out about it, and they came from Jabesh-Gilead, which is about 30 miles in that direction, took the bodies down, took them over to Jabesh, burned the bodies, and then buried the bones.
I think the author of 1 Samuel, in relating the history of the death of Saul, really wants us to feel the tragedy of what had happened. You know, Saul was selected in a moment of rebellion on the part of Israel. They were rejecting the judges, they were rejecting Samuel as a prophet, and they wanted a king to fight their battles. They wanted a king like the other nations. And so God gave them what they wanted, not necessarily what they needed. From the get-go, Saul was pretty unimpressive. To see him just so tragically fail and fall here, it's chilling to sit in this spot and to think about that. When we talk about geography and all of the places in the biblical narrative, that seems to fit and to back up what the story says. Coming to these places and seeing where they are and seeing the movement, all of that reinforces the reliability of the text. After David got the news of Saul dying on Mount Gilboa, he ends up being installed as king. He's been chased for over a decade. And so there's a part of him that's probably elated that finally he's getting to do what God set him apart to do. They're setting up some permanent roots, but at the same time, it came at a terrible cost. His father-in-law, the Lord's first anointed, and his best friend, Jonathan, have lost their life. You see that heartbreak when you read his beautiful song, mourning the loss of the Lord's anointed. You see that conflict in him just before he moves to Hebron.
I'm Craig.
And I'm Stu, and we're the...
I think I did it.
It came out. We'll find out when we see this. So
we're finished with 1 Samuel 31. Do you have some?
yeah, I mean,
Insights?
we've talked about how the Philistines just rout them, and the people of the men of Israel see it, and they abandon their cities. Bet-Shan is a walled city. It could have been defended for a long time. Certainly, it was a good place to defend, and they just left it. We went there. We stayed in a kibbutz nearby. We went up on Mount Gilboa. There's a road just over the crest that winds its way up, and we were right there. And you can look down and see Bet-Shan. And so they took the bodies of Saul and his sons and hung them on the walls. They're gloating. And the people, the ones that aren't gone, are certainly too afraid to challenge this. And so these men of Jabesh Gilead, they're over across the Jordan. They're on the wrong side of the tracks, but they're part of the tribe of Benjamin. And Saul is part of the tribe of Benjamin. And they come over in this daring, raid, and they pull the bodies down off the wall.
In the middle of the night.
Middle of the night, but they did it. No one else had the courage to do it. And we'll see this referred to in the next upcoming chapter. So
if you go to 2 Samuel verse 1, or chapter 1, after the death of Saul, David returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the third day, a man with torn clothes and dust on his head arrived from Saul's camp. When he came to David, he fell on the ground to pay him homage. "Where have you come from?" David asked. "I've escaped from the Israelite camp," he replied. "What was the outcome?" David asked. "Please tell me." "The troops fell from the battle," he replied. "Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." Then David asked the young man who had brought him this report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," he replied, "and there was Saul leaning on a spear with the chariots and the cavalry close in on him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out, and I answered him, 'Here I am.' 'Who are you?' he asked. So I told him, 'I am an Amalekite.' Then he begged me, 'Stand over me and kill me, for agony has seized me, but my life still lingers.' So I stood over him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown from that was on his head and the band that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord."
So a guy coming from the north, David knows that the Philistines have ridden out to fight Israel. We talked about that last week. So he knows. And he knows that someone coming from the north with his clothes torn and dirt in his hair, these are signs of mourning. And he's worried, obviously. And the guy tells him that Saul has fallen, and he wants to be sure. How do you know? How do you know it's not just a rumor? Lots of rumors and more. And the guy says, "Well, I was there. I saw it." And he says that Saul was gravely wounded, and that he asked him to finish him off. And he says, "And I did. I finished him off. And I took his crown and this armband, these symbols of the crown, the royalty, and I brought him here." And
So is this inconsistent with the last chapter that said Saul killed himself?
And there's the issue. And we see in commentaries and sermons and videos and everything else, there's this long running discussion. Is it inconsistent? because the other one says that Saul fell on his sword. The armor bearer saw that he was dead and then fell on his own sword. And this guy says he talked to Saul and finished him off. And it's just this hotly debated topic, but there's a clue here. After, going over it a whole bunch of times, I realized that you saw the pictures of Mount Gilboa, and it's steep. You can't really tell from that, but it's a steep hill. Chariots don't work. He says, I was there, and the cavalry and the chariots were closing in on Saul. Well, no, they weren't. So it's a pretty good sign that the guy's story is made up. We know that if the Philistines had found Saul's body and the crown and the armband had been there, they would have taken it. So it says this guy came on the body, maybe figured out, maybe was able to see what had occurred, and he writes himself into the story.
And he's an Amalekite.
He's an Amalekite. He's someone living, we learn later, he and his family have been living in Israel for generations. They're sort of protected foreigners, but he writes himself, and what we don't know is he leaves with the crown and the armband. And he comes south, kind of southwest, and he comes upon David. And there's, is it possible that he was coming to David because he knows, okay, David's going to be king? Or it's possible he was hightailing it down to his home country. Because if you draw a straight line from Mount Gilboa down through Ziklag, it comes out in the land of the Amalekites. So maybe he's going to take the crown home and say, I killed this Jewish king, and he becomes a celebrity. Maybe. Then again, maybe he actually came looking for David. What is pretty certain is he thinks that this is going to win him David's favor. And we're told later specifically, David says, yeah, that's what he was doing. And so he's gonna come to David and say, I finished off your mortal enemy, the guy who tried to kill you for the last 10 years. And he expects some thanks. He's brought the crown and the armband.
Then David took hold of his own clothes and tore them, and all the men who were with him did the same. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the people of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David inquired of the young man who had brought him the report, where are you from? I'm a son of a foreigner, he answered. I am an Amalekite. So David asked him, why were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Then David summoned one of the young men and said, go execute him. So the young man struck him down and he died. For David had said to the Amalekite, your blood be on your own head because your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I killed the Lord's anointed.
It seems pretty harsh, but at the same time, you can, in terms of politics and kings, you can understand it. But there is within the law, part of the law about killings. Killings are unintentional. They have different rules for. There are a few crimes that the punishment is death. And one of those is just murder. And it actually spells out, in fact, I had it in that same section, taking an iron instrument and striking someone, intentionally killing them. And there's no doubt that's what this Amalekite did. Whether Saul asked for it or not, it doesn't matter within the law. And so David may well be justified in doing exactly this.
The other part here, David and his men mourned.
And we mentioned in class today, Karen, if you had been there, you would have heard this. We mentioned in class that in the Middle East, they mourn. I mean, they let loose, they wail, they cry, they mourn. And we tend to repress things. We tend to hold them back in. But if you've ever seen it, you understand. And the thing that we see from that, part of what this is showing us, though, is that David genuinely mourned even for Saul. We know about Jonathan, but he mourned for the loss of Saul. And even though Saul had tried to kill him repeatedly, David mourns, legitimately, sincerely mourns.
And he goes after this, and then it says, David took up this lament for Saul and his son Jonathan, and he ordered that the sons of Judah be taught the song of the bow. It is written in the book of Jasher. And so there is what looks very similar to the Psalms, and it's a lament in honor of Saul and Jonathan. What is the book of Jasher?
Book of Jasher is some old text that no longer exists. It's referenced a few times. We know it existed, but it's lost. And somewhere in the late 1700s, early 1800s, somebody wrote a book of Jasher, and it's a total fraud. But we do have references to it.
So this lament is not in the Psalms, but it sounds very similar to a psalm David would have written. And it was a lament for both, like I said, for both King Saul and his son Jonathan.
There's one thing worth mentioning about the lament. There's a couple,
Okay.
but it is this really painful lament for Jonathan and Saul. And he talks about them soaring like eagles. It's really a tribute to them, but there's a point in there where it says how the mighty have fallen. And that has become this saying that we use with kind of a sneer when we see someone who we think deserves it finally get what they deserved. Oh, how the mighty have fallen.
Oh.
And it was not intended as that at all. It is legitimately talking about how these two mighty men had fallen on Gilboa.
2 Samuel, chapter 2. Sometime later, David inquired of the Lord, should I go up to one of the towns of Judah? Go up, the Lord answered. Then David asked, where should I go? To Hebron, replied the Lord. So David went there with his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David also took the men who were with him, each with his household, and they settled in the towns near Hebron.
So one of the big things that we should see from this, David is not king, but he's behaving kingly, but he's behaving as God's king should. And the first thing he does, he realizes now that Saul is dead, I can go home. I mean, he's free and clear. He can go home. And rather than just striking out, he takes the time to consult God and say, should I do this?
Because you got to remember, Ziklag was in the middle of the Philistine country, and that's where he was. And now he can go home. He can go to Judah.
That's right.
And Hebron is in Judah.
And that's his home. And Hebron has been more or less a capital of Judah. Abraham settled in there for a long time. It's important going all the way back to Abraham, but it is ostensibly the capital of Judah, and that's where he heads. Him and his two wives, we've just seen the king should have, but he's not king yet.
Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul. So David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead to tell them, the Lord bless you, because you have showed the kindness to Saul your Lord when you buried him. Now may the Lord show you loving devotion and faithfulness, and I will also show you the same favor because you have done this. Now then, be strong and courageous, for though Saul your Lord is dead, the house of Judah has anointed me as their king.
We have a guest. We have an artist, and she just came in and brought in some plates. She's sweet. So we have the men, when he gets to Hebron, the men of Judah come out and anoint him king of Judah. And one of the things that came out this week, we hear a lot of commentary. Later, they talk about the northern and southern kingdom. Judah and the other tribes sort of split. And a lot of people say that there was no northern and southern kingdom at this time, but there was. in effect. They had split, and the 10 northern tribes sort of formed this coalition, and Judah and Simeon's a minor tribe that's basically Judah now, but they sort of stay on their own. And even when Saul was king of all of Israel, it's an uneasy truce with Judah. And so it's almost inevitable that as soon as Saul is dead, they anoint David king of Judah. And the thing to keep in mind is Saul has a son living, and it hasn't been established yet that Israel won't have one overall king, but they jump the gun and they anoint David king of Judah. And then they tell David this story about these men of Jabesh Gilead who've come over, how Saul's body was being, had been hung up like that. And they come and rescue the body. They won't allow this insult to Saul, and they take him back. And David does another wise thing. He sends messengers to Jabesh Gilead, and he commends them for their loyalty to Saul. And the first thing that does is it shows that he's also loyal to Saul. The fact that he is commending them for being loyal, that's what he values, is loyalty to Saul. It's another way of saying, look, I never wanted Saul dead. And he tells them, now may the Lord show you loving devotion. And that is, by the way, hesed, once again. May the Lord show you hesed and faithfulness, and I will show you the same favor because you've done this. So he's taken these people of Jabesh Gilead, and he sent a message that, and it does say in the next verse, be strong and courageous, for though Saul your Lord is dead, you have no king. The house of Judah has anointed me as their king. So there is a king in Israel. And I know you guys are frightened because the Philistines have taken over, but he's letting them know there's a king in Israel and it's him. And everyone understands that. And he has repeatedly stated his loyalty to Saul. He hasn't actually said, you guys could come join us, but he held it out. It's always a possibility. And if you don't want to do that, at least you know that I have no animosity towards you. So it's a wise thing that he does. It's very, very well handled. And I think it's also sincere. I think it's very sincere on David's part.
So as God said, this was going on in the south and in the north. And the next verse 8 starts with meanwhile. So at the same time this was happening, and I'm going to read it in a second, but it talks about Abner. And Abner was the warlord for Saul. And he was also either Saul's cousin or uncle. And he is a very powerful man and a very bad guy, but head of basically his war team. Meanwhile, Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, took Saul's son Ishbosheth, moved him to Mahanaim, and made him king over Gilead, Asher, Jezreel, Ephraim, and Benjamin, over all Israel. Saul's son Ishbosheth was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned for 2 years. The house of Judah, however, followed David, and the length of time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months.
So I've mentioned, and Mary just mentioned, Abner's a very bad man. He is tough. He is a very ruthless, tough warlord, and he has served Saul very well. He's Saul's uncle or first cousin, and because they have long generations, we're not always sure, but he is a close relative of Saul. But Saul has a living son, Ishbosheth, and he's the king. He's rightfully the king, and there's no way that Abner can take over with Ishbosheth there. So what he does is, this area has been taken over by Philistines. He moves him over across the river to a safer place, and then he declares Ishbosheth king.
Which is strange that the commander of an army can make somebody a king, but that he could, and that's as high as Abner could get. Abner knew
that's
he couldn't
true.
be king.
And so what it tells us, though, is that Abner's running the show.
That's right.
Abner is declaring a king. Ishbosheth, we have a hint, but we see Ishbosheth is weak. Abner knows it. That name is really a nickname. We find out if you go to the book of Kings, it's not even Ishbosheth is not even his real name. It means man of shame. It's a nickname given to him, and we won't get into the reasons why. But it does tell us Ishbosheth is weak. Abner is the de facto king ruling from behind the throne.
So one day, Abner, son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, marched out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. So Joab, son of Zeruiah, along with the servants of David, marched out and met them at the pool of Gibeon. The two camps took up positions on opposite sides of the pool. Then Abner said to Joab, "Let us have the young men get up and compete before us." "Let them get up," Joab replied. So they got up and were counted off, 12 for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 for David. Then each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his sword into his opponent's side, and they all fell together. So this place, which is in Gibeon, is called Helkath Hasarim. The battle that day was intense, and Abner and the men of Israel were defeated by the servants of David.
So the first thing we see is that Abner puts together, an army, and they ride out. And remember, they've retreated up and this way for you. It's still the wrong way. They've retreated up and across the Jordan to a safer place. And so the only people really kind of securing this area is Judah. And now he gets together this force and he rides back down. There's no good in this. And Joab, who is David's warlord, also a very bad man. I mean, a very competent guy, hears about it and leads his people up. And as I've mentioned before, when you have an army in the field, you need water. And it's sort of almost inevitable. They wind up at this pool. And they come from opposite sides. And so they wind up on opposite sides of the pool, and they stare at each other. And what we said in class today is they're not supposed to be fighting each other.
They're both Jews.
They're both Jews. Jews don't. And the story that I told was while we were in Israel, a guy told me about a Jew who had stolen a bunch of military secrets, flown over to someplace in California, met someone and sold them. And the Mossad sent a team and had him executed. They killed him. And I said, well, he put the whole country at risk. And this guy who's told me the story says, no, you don't understand. Jews don't kill Jews. That's how it's supposed to be. They're not supposed to be fighting each other. And yet Abner has led this, and they sit on the opposite side of the pool. And as happens, a lot of the time, these little skirmishes, nobody knows how to get them started. And they sit up and they eyeball each other. And finally, Abner says, hey, I got an idea. Let's have some of the young men wrestle with each other. We'll have them fight. We'll see who's toughest, you or us.
12 on each side.
Let's have them fight. And Joab, being Joab, says, line them up. Yeah, I'm ready. And what you see in this little skirmish is the animosity that has developed between North and South. And so what could have been a fight instantly escalates into swords and knives. And everyone is kind of surprised, I guess, but they just, all 12 of each side, they kill each other off. And it's later known as the Hill of Blades or the Hill of Knives. Bad idea. But once that happened, once each side sees some of their own being killed, a fight is on.
And so we're going to end it here, but the battle that day was intense, and Abner and the men of Israel were defeated by the servants of David. So we stop here with Abner's guys being defeated and running off, and we'll take it up next week.
I think that went rather better than earlier.
I think so.